Okay. Well, hello, and welcome to the first ever Women in Agribusiness webinar. I'm Joy O'Shaughnessy, the Chief Operating Officer of the Agribusiness Division of HighQuest Partners, the parent company of Women in Agribusiness. Thank you for joining us today. It's our plan to continue this series of informational industry webcasts throughout the year, in addition to the already established HighQuest webinars that are under the brands of Global Ag Investing and the Ag Club. Today, there are attendees from 20 countries spanning the globe joining us for this presentation about investing in regenerative agriculture and food. I feel signaling how important this topic is. And we're grateful that you're taking the time to be here. And in case this is the first time you've interacted with us, I do want you to know that the goal of Women in Agribusiness is to build a platform for women to keep up to date on the latest developments in the ag sector, to highlight their experience, to build their networks, to find opportunities for advancement. And we have multiple ways and initiatives that we use to help us reach these goals, such as our annual conferences, both in Europe and in North America. And the North American Summit is celebrating its 10th anniversary in September. We also have our Career Connector, our regularly scheduled networking meetups, our Ignite Female Farmer Expo, our student scholarships and membership platforms, and much more. And you can find information on all of these programs on our website, womeninag.com, but we'll also have links in the chat. And if you'd like to receive information about our events and media products, we invite you to subscribe there. Our next webinar is coming up on May 20th, and it's an executive profile where we'll be highlighting 3 senior level women from Latin America. And I hope you can join us for that. Now, I know some of you may be wondering why we would have a male speaker today for our Women in Agribusiness webinar. And the short answer for that is that we are dedicated to providing our mostly female audience the best quality content from all voices. And that's what we have here today. So the format for this next hour is our guest speaker will give his presentation. Then we'll take questions from you for him that I ask that you put into the chat and send it to me, because you can choose who to send your question to. So Joy is who you want to send that to. And if there's enough time after all the questions have been asked, we'll break out into smaller groups to network amongst ourselves. And in case there's not enough time, I do recommend that you look at the attendee list and send out LinkedIn invitations to connect with the other attendees, since they clearly share an interest in this topic as well as you do. So our speaker today is Koen van Seijen, and since 2011, Koen's been following the regenerative agriculture and food space when he stumbled upon the carbon sequestration potential of regenerative farming. Under the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food, he has published more than 120 podcast interviews with impact investors, fund managers, farmers, and many others. Regenerating soils and ecosystems by putting money, both big and small, to work is the central theme that drives him. He's also the manager at the nonprofit Tonic and a partner at a financial advisory firm in Milan, Italy. Welcome to Women in Agribusiness, Koen.
Thank you so much for this opportunity and having me here today. And I will go ahead and share the screen, and definitely the topic of women in ag is extremely important to us. We've highlighted many and are always looking for more. And actually there's a lot happening in the broader space of regenerative agriculture, especially also looking at, let's say, the historically not featured. Like if you look at the general farming conferences compared to obviously here, there's a lot happening in, especially the last years in the space next to the traditional space. So let's go to, I'll share my screen that I'm actually not allowed to do. John, can you allow me to share my screen?
Oh, sorry about that. Give us one moment.
Yeah, it's a standard feature of Zoom. They always take it away from everyone. It's not something new.
Of all the buttons we remember to check,
security
there's always
is
one you
of
forget.
Security is one of them. No, so thank you so much for this. I'm very happy to, I'm simply, because we've done so many interviews, and actually since last time we talked, I think we're at up 130 now. We have an overview of what's happening, or we hope at least what's happening in the world, and I'm very happy to report back of the amazing things that are happening in terms of regenerating soils at scale. and especially when it comes to the role of finance there. And there's always tension, obviously, the investors, the big finance world, the smaller finance world, like how do you put money to work and get it back? And I'm still not able to share my screen. I don't know if John can.
Let me see if I can, maybe I can.
Yeah, you should be able to, in security, there's a feature.
Try it out, Koen.
Allow
Sorry about this.
participants to share their screen. Oh.
Is that working for you now?
Now it is mode, and just tell me if it's not working. That's probably better.
It is. It's up. There we go.
So
problem.
I think it's perfect. There we go. Sorry for the technical issues. Let's get going because we have a lot to discuss, and mostly I'm very interested, obviously, if there are questions, and I'll try to answer them or point in other directions if we have made interviews with people or I know people that are working on it, etc. So welcome to the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture and Food. We started with agriculture and we've added food. Like Joy was saying, I stumbled upon this movement now 11 years ago, and basically through the, let's say, the carbon perspective. I was very interested and very worried still on climate change, and I discovered this movement of farmers that promised to be able to store a lot of carbon. Since I've discovered that the story is a lot bigger than the carbon piece. You see it a lot in the news now, and it's definitely, it's very eye-catching, like the soil is the biggest carbon sponge in the world, et cetera, et cetera. But it's about a lot more than that. It's about obviously healthy food. It's about biodiversity. It's about water. It's about oxygen. And so we really depend on the soil. The first couple of centimeters, first meter maybe of topsoil really sustains life on Earth. And most of our food, most of our fibers, and most of our vegetable oils come from there. And we haven't been treating it, let's say, in the best way possible. We've learned a lot lately. So just to give a bit of background, like Joy said, I'm a manager at Tonic, which is a community of active impact investors globally, and I'm managing the working group within there. So we are not making the investments for our members. Our members are all investors, but I'm leading the working group on regenerative food and agriculture, which is obviously amazing because then the day we kept Tonic, I can also talk about soil. I'm a small retail investor, so do take everything I share here with a pinch of salt. I'm not investing in most of these funds because they're simply inaccessible, which is very frustrating because I would love to, just as I can participate in renewable energy projects with a few €100 or dollars. Many cases, it's not possible to do that in regenerative agriculture. And I would love to do that more. I think it's going to come, but it's not usually not there yet. And then since 2016, which is probably most relevant for the story here, is we've been hosting conversations on exploring the tension, how to put money to work to regenerate soils, people, local communities, and ecosystems, and making a fair return. And that's been quite a journey, I can tell you. So this is not investment advice. I always have to repeat this. Seek financial advice before making any investment. This is purely the sharing of our experience and lessons learned, and mostly generating a lot more questions than answers in many cases. So why am I looking at this? I mentioned the carbon perspective, but if you look at this, already a slightly older picture, but it's very relevant here, because if you look at all these different pieces of the pie, basically of where we are at, probably every single one can be brought back to the connection to land, soil, agriculture, and forestry. So how we're managing our lands. And probably the most scary pieces are the ones with the question marks, because we don't know yet how far we are in the red potentially and how far we're outside this scheme. So I think we can safely say that whatever we'd like to, if you look at the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, if you look at this sphere, if you look at the donut economy, like every single problem at the end, almost every single problem comes back to how we treat the land, and comes back to, in some cases, people argue 12,000 years of agriculture that we have to improve, and we cannot escape the fact that we need clean water, the fact that we need topsoil to grow food. Even though we see a lot of indoor farming coming, but it's very, very marginal. And so we better face reality and look at how we can still grow the quantity and quality food we need in a way that doesn't deplete the soils. For sure, you've seen these articles and probably also know that it's not really correct, the 60 years. It really depends on where you are. In some cases, it's a lot less. Some cases, it's more. But what I really found interesting is the second sentence here, which is maybe a bit too small to read. But generating 3 centimeters of topsoil takes 1,000 years. And what gives me a lot of hope is that we see a lot of farmers that are doing that way faster. So we've seen farmers creating actually inches of topsoil and many more centimeters in a decade or maybe slightly more. So it is possible. Something that we didn't really know was possible until relatively recently is to, with management practices, to regenerate soils that are very, very severely degraded. So, and that gives me a lot of hope because a decade or two we have pretty much, if you look at a lot of the charts we saw before, the pie chart. So it is definitely possible. The question is how to do it at scale and how to do it at a scale that makes a dent in all the issues we have. So I really got excited about soil, and this is from actually northern Italy, where Slow Food has a wine bank. So basically they stored a lot of the soil of different wines, and you can see how, because let's say the wine industry has understood terroir a lot more than the rest of the food industry, and I think we can learn a lot to how soils express themselves through plants into the wine or into tomatoes, into other products. There's a lot to learn there. So my initial interest came through that CO2 per hectare. And it's a very interesting quote if you read it and you see a lot of excitement about it. And until now, like I understood recently or relatively recently that the story is much bigger. It's about water capacity, it's about biodiversity, but it's definitely also about carbon. Like soil is an enormous sponge. It was an enormous bank of stored carbon. And we have mined a lot of that, and a lot of that ended up in the air and into the oceans. And there is a chance to put a lot of that back, not just because of the carbon, but also definitely because of the more carbon is part of your soil in many cases, the more water you can store, the more biodiversity in your soil. It's sort of a currency. Like you want your bank account to be maybe not too full, because you can also have too much, but you want it to be reasonably full. And most of the soils, if you look at the world, we have about 2 billion hectares, which are severely degraded. So you can do the calculation here, how much tons we can store. Theoretically, it depends on the place, depends on the crops, depends on hooked about 10 or 11 years ago by the late Tony Lovell, who set up still one of the main fund managers in the space of regenerative agriculture and food. So what is Regen Ag? You will hear the term a million times these days, which is great because it really helps the space, but it's very difficult to define for a very good reason. And I found an interesting definition between brackets, where regenerative agriculture is a system of farming principles and practices that increases biodiversity, enriches soils, improves watersheds, and enhances ecosystem services. And I wouldn't focus too much I would focus on the words increasing, enriching, improving, and enhancing. Why? Because it shows it's a journey. It shows it's not a certification scheme. It's not something you can be or not be, like, are you a regenerative farmer or not? Are you a regenerative company or not? No, it's something you aspire to be. It's a North Star. Probably you're never finished. And you are using this set of farming principles and practices to increase the biodiversity of your soils, to increase the biodiversity above your soils. But we don't know there's no maximum of biodiversity. So it's very important I think if there's only one thing you take away from this webinar is that Regen Ag is not a thing. You cannot be it or not be it. It's a system of practices and principles that depend on where you are, and it's a journey that never ends. So it's definitely a continuum, and I think the next picture shows that the best way. This comes from an article written by a friend of mine called Ethan Soloviev, that we can definitely share after as well, where you can see this continuum. Like somewhere on this line, most of the farmers in the world are, but it doesn't mean anybody is done or finished. And it's very frustrating to see in the news people arguing about if they are a regenerative farmer or not. And it's simply extremely difficult, probably impossible to pinpoint what it is. And it's a set of practices that depends where you are. If you're farming olive trees, it's very different than livestock and very different from row crops or tomatoes, etc. But you can be more regenerative or less regenerative. I think that's the central theme. So why is it so interesting for investors? Why do I see a lot of people listening to the podcast we host, coming to webinars, and starting to be very interested in in regenerative agriculture and how to potentially put money to work. I think this picture, you probably have seen pictures like that with no-till versus a conventional or minimum till, and you can really see the difference. You can see you don't have to be an agronomist or a farmer to see which one probably yields more this year. These are side by side, so the same climate, the same weather, and the only thing different is the management. And this is 2012, there are many more studies, created a real movement or start creating a real movement of farmers that are going for this, let's go to this in a second, going for this more diversity, very complex cover crop rotations, etc., to really build their soil and have a product and have something. Because in this year of drought, the farmer on the left probably depends on which one you're looking at. If it's still around the conventional minimum till will have a hard time, and probably prices are going to be high. And the farmer with the dog on the other side will have a really good year. The other question I get very often, not just what is regen ag, which is a very tricky one, but also can we feed the world? And the answer is relatively straightforward. We're producing enough calories at the moment, I think, to feed 11 point something billion people. So we are sort of feeding the world, apart from all the cases of obesitas and, of course, hunger in the world. So it's not that we're doing a great job now, but if you look at the data, and this is from 2015, so mind you, there's a lot more data out there at the moment. But it's definitely possible, especially if you start searching for agroecology practices. Don't look for organic or non-organic, because those comparison studies are very flawed. But if you look for agroecology practices, you see a lot of data on productivity that at least as high or higher. And that gives a lot of hope. Like, people are continuously outperforming. And if you just look at the picture we saw before, it's very clear who's going to have the highest harvest in that case. So it's definitely possible. But I think the most important piece for the investment world or the finance world or the entrepreneurial world is that you're looking at a higher profitability, because costs are so much lower. You're really cutting a lot on your inputs, and you have less volatility. And that's an interesting combination to look at, because generally agriculture is the exact opposite. So that's why I think we see so much interest from the investment world. It doesn't mean it's very easy to put money to work, but it definitely means that there's going to be a lot of movement over the next years, because people are looking for steady returns, are looking for profitability, obviously, and the volatility. Let's say they see in other markets, and they see with all the droughts, etc., and floods, they see it also in agriculture. And just to shock people a bit with, if you haven't studied soil science, and I'm sorry if you're deep into soil science and all of this is very known to you, but I always am shocked of two things on this slide. One is how much life there is in healthy soil. So this is an acre or 0.4 hectares. And then the last sentence, that a gram of soil may hold, there's a may here, a billion different bacteria, and we only named 5%. This is a couple of years ago. We might be at 10 now or 15. But it means there's a lot to discover in healthy soils. There's a lot that we don't know yet about the connection, and we get there in a second, between healthy soil, healthy people, healthy produce, etc. So we're really at the beginning. We know a lot of things intuitively, but the research and science of this part, I think the soil food web was discovered 15 or 20 years ago only. And many of the research is really, really fresh, and many of the research simply hasn't been done because we haven't looked at a soil in this way. So then, just to share with you a bit our journey, we've done now over 130 interviews, a number of series, and I just want to share a few before I wrap up, and I want to open up for questions. A few of the themes we really see as a crucial theme for the next, let's say, 10, 15 years. Where are the pieces within the broader regenerative food and agriculture space that deserve, according to us, obviously, our humble opinion, more attention? And we've been trying to do more and more interviews in that specific space. So one is food as medicine. We already touched upon it. There's a lot of research coming out looking at our basically our microbial system inside, and this relationship between healthy soil, healthy produce, healthy gut system, healthy people, and then obviously healthy ecosystem. So can we make this case of food as medicine? And it's probably the oldest sentence we know in Greek, let food be thy medicine. And it's something that has been severely understudied. If you look at how many hours the general, let's say, people that study medicine get in terms of food and diet, it's in some cases only a couple in their full study. It probably determines most of how we operate, who we are, how we feel, etc. They call your gut system the second brain for a good reason. But it's very fascinating if you start diving into nutrient density. Where does it come from? What does healthy soil mean, etc.? There's simply not that much. We've been doing interviews in it, but we've done not so many because there isn't so much happening here. All the diet stuff obviously is interesting, but if you start asking questions on, okay, what is the level of nutrients in that broccoli? Most people have no answer simply because we haven't been able to research that. There is a lot coming. We've been really surprised the last years, and I think the next 5 years we're going to see a lot. I think this sentence, food as medicine, you're going to hear in different forms and shapes. Obviously, you're going to hear a lot. So it's something to be very aware of, because this could create a huge market for healthy soils, because it leads to healthy produce. And devices like this, if you look carefully, this is 3D printed. I have one of those. It costed quite an interesting amount, and it's not very useful, but it is a first version of a bionutrient meter. Like, how do you measure nutrient density on the spot on the farm? And the next version will be better, and probably the third version will actually be useful. But it is a movement that's happening, and don't be surprised to see these things in a couple of years in the field, maybe in larger food companies, maybe even with some consumers. Let's see how that plays out. The next point we really try to focus on, and we've looked at even less than food as medicine because they're simply not happening so much, is how do we get this to a landscape scale? It's great if we have 1 or 2 farmers that are really working their soils. They are creating a lot of biodiversity. They are increasing the water storing capacity. They're reducing the floods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that only will be 1 or 2 farmers in a full landscape or watershed. How do we bring this discussion of how do we manage landscapes? Because at the end of the day, we are managing landscapes, if we like it or not. How do we bring that to a much bigger scale? How do we look what to plant where and why? How do we discuss how to bring back rivers? Because we are able to do that. We've seen examples of that. But we need to have an integrated approach on a landscape scale. That means most of the farmers in a watershed need to cooperate, which is not so easy. But these are the discussions we need to have if we want to restore full landscapes and not just a farm here or a farm there. And also here, technology is going to play a big role, but also obviously the social side is something that really needs to happen. And that really will enable us to this is in Spain, to bring an area like this back to life, literally, socially, culturally, and obviously environmentally, because a lot of places in the world, and you will all know places like that as well, partly because of agricultural practices, have really, really suffered. Suffered economically, suffered socially, and suffered environmentally. And this enables us to restore some of that, but it needs a coordinated approach. Then a very hot topic, we've done quite a few interviews because a lot is happening here, is how do we pay farmers for the ecosystem services? So how do we pay farmers for carbon, or land stewards, for carbon storage, biodiversity, water, etc.? A lot of startups, there's a lot happening in this space. There's a lot of noise in the space, and what I find very fascinating is that most of it is based on models, simply saying, okay, if you go from till to no till and you apply a cover crop mix of X, Y, Z, and you're in that area, we assume you're storing this amount of carbon. I think we're going to see a lot of outcome-based systems looking at, okay, how much did you actually store, which is going to, probably some farmers are going to suffer from that, and some others that have done a really, really good job in managing their soils are going to benefit. Hot topic here, obviously, is what about the farmers that are very advanced and that have regenerated their soils for the past 20 years in some cases? They don't have the possibility to go further a lot, meaning that they won't raise that much funding from these kind of systems. So we're sort of starting to pay the farmers that have done the worst job until now to basically that have the biggest potential. So that's a very interesting one that we need to work out, because you cannot punish the ones that are most advanced, because you might create a system where somebody says, okay, I will plow up my land even after I've been no-till for 20 years, simply to get the ecosystem payments. And that's something, obviously, as society, we should want to avoid. What I find very interesting are the models that look at biodiversity and water as well, and not just carbon, because the story, as I said, is so much bigger. And then the sort of overarching one is transition finance for farmers. How do we finance? How do we partner with farmers? Many local banks are not able yet to finance transitions with regenerative practices. They barely understand or are able to underwrite the organic transition, and let alone if you're going to integrate a lot of other tree crops, if you're going to integrate animals, if you, et cetera, et cetera. So we need institutions, we need investors, we need resources to partner with farmers that want to make this transition and make sure we help them through it, because it is a rough transition. It's absolutely not easy, but it's also a very interesting investment opportunity, simply just like renewable energy was a number of years ago. So just to summarize, we're looking a lot at food as medicine, landscape scale regeneration, payment systems for farmers, for ecosystem services, transition finance. That doesn't mean there are not others, like food waste, nutrients, the role of livestock, et cetera, but we decided not to focus on that. If you want to know more how we did that, we have a full framework, which I won't discuss here, but we have done some work to pick these basically because we think there's the most potential over the next 10 to 15 years. And then just one to end up that I think I added later to the slides. We're starting to see a lot of regenerative enterprises, a lot of discussion of let's not just focus on the soil. We need enterprises that are extremely ambitious when it comes to regenerating soil, but also extremely ambitious when it comes to the rest, what happens on top, which could be land access, inequality, racism in farming, obviously access to healthy food for all instead of just a happy few. And a lot of other topics that are very intimately connected to agriculture, but often not discussed when we are talking about regenerative agriculture. Expect to see a lot more articles that are basically trying to make the point that this story of regeneration is a lot broader than just soil. And we're definitely gonna focus on that as well. So if you want to know more, I know I talk fast, but we covered only, we just scratched the surface, pun intended. We recorded the video course, which is pay what you think it's worth. So it's accessible to all. Simply go to investinginregenerativeagriculture.com/course, and you will find all the information there. And obviously, everywhere you listen to podcasts, you can find our podcast, which is Investing in Regenerative Agriculture. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat or follow up later. I'm more than happy to try to point you somewhere where hopefully somebody has an answer. And with that, if you want to know more, the best thing always to do, if it has been a while or you are not living on a farm using a regenerative approach, is visit one and spend time and listen. It's extremely interesting, extremely complex, especially if you come from a city like myself, but also extremely fascinating. And it's going to be a long transition, but it's going to be extremely interesting to follow this or to be part of it. So with that, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Koen. That was wonderful and precise and compact. And so we have another half an hour to our program today, and their questions are flooding in. So I'm going to start with those. Just to remind folks, if you have a question, please put it in the chat directed to me. And depending on how much time is left, we'll either have open networking afterwards, or we will fill him up with questions. So the first one that I want to approach is one of our attendees is saying, my organization is focused on training farmpreneurs in regenerative ag and giving them land to start their business. Do you know of any organizations training emerging or new farmers in regenerative ag?
It's a very good question. I think the training part is absolutely crucial. It depends a bit where you're located. There's a huge lack of education. Let's say education of practical education on the field. You see a lot of people going for internships at successful or let's say farmers that are ahead in terms of some of the practices. But it's definitely not something the current ag universities are, or at least I know in Europe and partly in the US, are really offering. So it's very difficult. Most people I know that are making progress are self-trained in a sort of way and have worked at a lot of other farms. So far it seems like a lot of the training is coming because you have been operating the livestock operation on a successful farm, or because it's really learning by doing, because it's been relatively recent that a lot of these practices have resurfaced or at least been mixed together. So I don't know. I think there must be a few ag universities for sure in the US or in Canada that are offering something, but it's very, very limited, unfortunately. And it really depends where you are, how you can learn it, because it's so context specific that it does make sense to study in your watershed or your ecosystem. And there's a question of how much you can learn from something that's on the other side of the country. So we're still very early on in terms of education, extreme gap needed to be filled, honestly.
Gotcha. And this person is in the West Coast of Canada, if that made a difference to your answer, but
I wouldn't know all the ag universities there. but also there is the most interesting things in this case, and that's also for the scientific part. I don't know if there will be questions about that, but it are happening on farms and not on universities at the moment, and that has many different reasons. But it's really the pioneers are current farmers, and which means we need to go and learn and observe and scale and help, etc. But it has to happen on the farm.
Great. So we're going to move on to our next question. We're starting to see global CPGs like Pepsi launching payout programs for farmers engaged in carbon sequestration and regenerative ag to offset the company's carbon footprint. And to be honest, that's where I think that's just more of a statement, but would you like to respond to that statement?
Yeah, it's definitely been an interesting first, 4 months into the year with enormous statements left and right. I think two things. One, it's great that soil is on the agenda, even at the boardrooms of those enormous companies. Two, it's they need to do a lot of work internally to obviously first reduce their own emissions before starting to insetting it somewhere else. And we need to really ask questions about, okay, how far do they go? In a sense, are we going to pay farmers to do a simple cover crop mix and call it regenerative ag? Or is it going to be quite complex and quite extreme and quite, let's say, more to the green side if you look at the arrow continuum? And many of these things will be, I wouldn't say regen ag washing, but will be the lighter version, which is still great because if it's many hectares or many acres and a lot of chemical inputs are no longer used and we have some cover crops, but the potential is a lot more, let's say. And we, I think as society, need to hold them accountable. Okay, what does regen ag in this case mean? Let's measure the acres, but also the amount of practices and approaches, and see, because General Mills has done a number of huge announcements, the same, and which is all amazing because they've never done it until now. But we need to start following. Okay, what is actually happening on the ground, and how much was already happening anyway? So what's the additionality, and how can we continue to push those approaches and make them more complex at the end?
Okay, great. Moving on. In Europe, EIT Food has some training resources on regenerative training, and they were working with farmers in Spain and Italy to transition to regenerative farming. So I think this person just wanted to contribute that thought to what you were saying.
Yeah, which is great. Actually, we helped them out here in Italy to get going. And one of if you watch the video of EIT on YouTube, it's of a farmer that's literally 10 minutes from where I'm at now. I would have recorded on the field, but I thought it was too risky for the connection. So it's great that a group like EIT, which is an enormous European funded program, is waking up to regenerative ag, and is waking up honestly to partnering with farmers in education, because until a year ago or 2 years ago, the farmer, in their changing of the food policy and food program, etc., the farmer wasn't present, which is obviously a bit odd. So I'm very happy with that attention for the farmers, and that they're actually that are training and they're putting resources there.
Someone just asked really quickly, since we're talking about this, she asked if we can share the resources mentioned. It's EIT.
Yeah, it's EIT food.com, I'm assuming, and you'll find some regenerative things on there.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I can find it later as well and send it to you, Joy, to follow up.
No worries. And then, okay, so we have a bunch of other questions. Do you know of any scalable and credible techniques to measure carbon? Sorry, let me phrase this. Credible and scalable techniques to measure soil carbon baseline without expensive soil carbon tests in a lab?
That would be the holy grail. So no, the short answer is no. I know of one group that's working. They are called Yardstick, if I'm not mistaken. They were under the radar, but I think they had a big article in TechCrunch, so they are public. They are working on a small soil measurement device that you can basically add to a drill, a normal power drill. So you go through the land, and basically with the GPS, it's included. So basically you drill a hole until probably 30 centimeters. It does measure the soil. They're not done yet. It's not out there, but they're working on making it very easy. There are a lot of remote sensing companies that promise a lot of things to be done through satellites, etc. I haven't seen anything yet that really is able to measure soil carbon a bit deeper or a bit more at depth. So it's one of those big unknowns. Like, how do we measure it without digging it up, sending it to the lab, and burning it basically, and then measure it again, which is how we measure soil carbon at the moment. And I don't know how we're going to build all these marketplaces on soil carbon without actually measuring a lot of this. But I'm sure there will be devices to because we need to measure it, and it fluctuates and it changes almost per field for sure, and per parts of the field as well. So there isn't a lot, unfortunately, but it's coming.
Okay, well, thanks. We have greetings from Western Australia, the poorest soils in the world. Are banks considering supporting farmers with low interest loans? There's a saying, it's hard to be green when you're in the red.
Absolutely. So not yet is, I think, the short answer. We've done a full series on transition finance for farmers with our co-host, which is a farmer in Eastern Germany, close to Berlin. And one of the first conversation was with the bank, probably one of the most sustainable banks in the world. And they simply said, we cannot do it yet because we need more data, more years of data to understand this transition. We now understand organic, and that's already quite complicated for us. I know Rabobank is doing something with pipeline foods in the US, but the most innovative transition finance is coming not from banks, but from groups like the Perennial Fund and Mad Agriculture in the US. And some crowd lending platforms in France, etc. So it's definitely a space where the banks are not playing yet because they're simply waiting.
Okay.
Unfortunately.
In terms of measuring regenerative ag, could you talk a bit more on this topic?
Yeah, I think it's you see some. I think the most interesting pieces are outcome based. So really trying to measure the increase in biodiversity or the increase in water holding capacity, obviously soil carbon, but as we discussed, it's quite tricky. But to establish a number of KPIs that you want to measure of this piece of land or this farm that is and a baseline, and that's going to transition. And I've seen some interesting ones, which could even be on simply the amount of insects or the amount of insect types. Like you have to find a proxy that does tell you if this land is moving, let's say, forward or not. And it could be the quantity or the different types of insects. It could be the quality of the water runoff to measure the lowest point of the farm to see how many chemicals or what's still or how much nitrogen is coming out. So you have to find some proxies because it's not so easy to measure this carbon piece, for instance. But you see a lot of interesting work being done, for instance, by Soil Mentor, which is coming out of Vida Cycle, coming out of the UK, that gives farmers very simple tools, like very simple tests you can do that anybody can do on the kitchen table to measure the quality of your soil over time, which could be the count of rainworms, could be the floating test, could be et cetera, et cetera. If you do that consistently in the same spot, which you obviously have to save GPS wise, you can actually start seeing if your management changes have had an impact. So there is this movement from super technological to you have to do it yourself as well and observe. And it's tricky. It's tricky to see something as complex as an ecosystem, which it at the end is, to see it moving. But it is definitely possible to monitor, but you probably have to monitor a few different things that then are proxies for the rest of the system.
Are you finding that vineyards and the wine industry is ahead of other ag categories for crops in adopting and advancing regenerative production?
Definitely in selling it. That's they're really good at selling terroir, which is something we all have to do. I mean, people joke like a farmer might need a better banker, might need more technology, might need better seeds, but they all need a market. And these guys and girls are really good at selling. And what you see is very many of the extreme quality wines are farmed biodynamically and are farmed with an extreme attention for the soil because it does translate into quality. And so I would say, yes, I think the wine industry and some other of the higher margin space, because that's what we're talking about, are definitely ahead in terms of selling terroir, but also dealing with the soil in a way that results in quality, in taste, in nutrient density, and measuring during the season and measuring biodiversity and producing lighter bottles to a company here in Italy and really be attentive to the environment. And then, of course, you have still the traditional wine industry where you see a row of wine, like a vineyard, and everything else is bare in between. And when the wind comes, basically your soil washes away or blows away. So there's a lot more examples in wine that are quite advanced.
Question is, do you see this system as viable or effective?
Absolutely. I think when you see the change of what some of these farmers have done to, and I think White Oak Pasture, so Will Harris just took, it's actually quite an interesting article on their website. They took some traditionally farmed grainland and showed in a couple of years what they can do in terms of different management. And you see that land changing, and you see it almost coming back to life, which is obviously an interesting term. And when you see the examples of almond groves in California, and there's some research actually until in the profitability of that, like let's say using regenerative approaches versus non-regenerative. And I asked the researcher on the podcast, like, describe those orchards, like how do they feel? And he said, no, the ones that are applying regenerative practices, that's the place you want to be. You want to be under those trees because there's a lot of cover crop, there are no bare soil, the trees look relatively healthy. It's a place that's relatively fresh. You want to stay. But then if you look at the neighbor, you have that image of the tree that's barely alive, kept alive with a lot of chemicals and other inputs, and you see like the dust underneath, basically. So I think in terms of viability, we still have to prove to do this on the landscape scale, but in individual cases, you can find them at any scale from 0.5 hectares all the way up to tens and hundreds of thousands in Australia that have done remarkable things in if you look at geology, very little time. Like this is 5-10 years in some cases, which is nothing if we look at the history of agriculture of the last 12,000 years.
Wow. Okay, we have one last question, and then we're going to go into networking breakouts. So the last question of the hour is, what are the top 2 or 3 use cases for analytics in your area?
That's a good question. I would, if I could dream, definitely nutrient density. Can we measure the level of nutrients and what they mean, because that's not so easy, in a tomato and show that this tomato is fundamentally different? And we see that in some lab analytics now, like this carrot compared to this carrot, they look the same. They don't taste the same, but they look the same. But this one has 10, 50, 100 times more, whatever vitamins you would like to have. And this one comes from a healthy soil. And that difference, because we always talk about we should eat more vegetables, but we never talk about how these vegetables should be grown, or we should eat more X or more Y. But the underlying question is, okay, but what does it mean? Like this broccoli comes from somewhere and could be completely empty or actually full of chemicals you don't want, or could be extremely healthy. The question is, you cannot really see it from outside. So if we could analyze that and have a framework around it, and people are working on it, but we love to have more people working on that, I think it could really exit us from a lot of the commodity focus and start hopefully benefiting farmers that are doing an amazing job growing quality, tasty food and are not being compensated for it now because the market simply throws everything on, not everything, but throws everything in one pot and sells it as tomatoes, as ingredients somewhere. Yeah.
Right. Gotcha. Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Koen,
Thank you so much.
for providing the information and then obviously and taking the questions.